America and other free and open societies face crucial challenges and opportunities abroad that affect security and prosperity at home. This is a series of conversations with guests who bring deep understanding of today's battlegrounds and creative ideas about how to compete, overcome challenges, capitalize on opportunities, and secure a better future. I am H.R. McMaster. This is Battlegrounds.
On today's episode of Battlegrounds, our focus is on civics education. Our guest is Paul Carrese, the founding director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Dr. Carrese was a professor of political science at the U.S. Air Force Academy for nearly 2 decades. He has held fellowships at Oxford University, Harvard University, the University of Delhi, and Princeton University. Dr. Carrese has authored and edited multiple books. His most recent book is entitled Democracy in Moderation: Montesquieu, Tocqueville, and Sustainable Liberalism. From 2019 to 2021, Dr. Carrese co-led a national study funded by the NEH and U.S. Department of Education, Educating for an American Democracy, on improving American history and civics education in K-12 schools. According to Educating for American Democracy, America is in a Sputnik moment that requires invigorated efforts in K-12 and higher education. While improvements in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education are important, deficiencies in humanities have left generations of Americans without a solid understanding of U.S. history and civics. Reform is difficult because there is discord among academics, educators, politicians, and citizens about U.S. history's meaning and how it should be taught. The failure to prioritize and invest in rigorous American history and civics education has devastated America's civic strength and civic health. One byproduct of this neglect is America's polarization and political dysfunction. Enhanced history and civics education helps citizens appreciate the great gifts of our free society, as well as how we can work together to improve it and build a better future for generations to come. Civics education can help us appreciate our differences and understand our common identity as citizens of a republic in which we all have a say in how we are governed. Civics-educated citizens are best prepared to elect qualified leaders of character and hold them accountable for governing well and strengthening our democratic institutions and processes. We welcome Dr. Carrese to discuss the need for civics and history education and proposals to renew civics education, to rekindle in American youth an understanding of American history and an appreciation for the virtues and great promise of America, as well as our nation's shortcomings and imperfections.
Paul Carrese, welcome to Battlegrounds. It's a real pleasure to see you. And hey, thanks for your tremendous leadership in leading a school that I think is really important to restoring our strategic confidence as Americans. This series is about strategic competence mainly, and an effort to try to view complex challenges abroad from the perspective of others. But in this session, we're going to talk about your role and hear your thoughts about how to restore our confidence in who we are as a people, and our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. And we're doing so at a time when we see a democracy under assault by an authoritarian regime. So it couldn't be, it's difficult timing, a sad time, but it could be better timing to have this conversation. Thanks for making the time to be with us.
Thank you so much, HR, for having me. Thanks to the Battlegrounds podcast and your team, the Hoover Institution. It's an honor to be talking with you and be talking with your audience. I look forward to it.
Well, it sounds trite sometimes, Paul, but really the answer, to so many of the challenges we face is education, right? And what I'd like to do is ask you, what is the gap you're trying to fill, the need you're trying to fill in the area specifically of civics education and helping citizens understand better, the nature of our democracy and their role in it?
Well, it's great to have the credibility of someone like yourself, very experienced in public life and in national security and in combat to say that education matters. I'll outrank you, HR, and say the first general I know of to do this in American history was George Washington, right? At the founding of the country, in several important addresses, and finally in his farewell address, explicitly stating how important it was for a free people to be educated if a free constitutional republic was to be maintained. And as you know, as a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, he and his Treasury Secretary Hamilton wanted a national military academy. They couldn't get it in his administration. Eventually it comes. He and Hamilton also wanted a national university. So the writings go back to the beginning of the American Free Constitutional Republic, that we will not be able to maintain. We can have the best laws on the book, so to speak, the best constitutional forms, but we will not be able to maintain liberty, including, as Washington knew, in a dangerous world, unless we have citizens who are informed, engaged, and we have time to talk about this. That it also includes the civic virtues of respecting that free people will disagree, respecting that there are different parties or philosophical viewpoints. So there's, as you know, you wrote about it in your book, Battlegrounds, there is an enormous deficit now. There are many sources of the problem, but more or less across at least the last 50 years, various educational institutions, higher ed, my tribe, a professor my whole career, and to some extent in K-12 as well, just taking our eye off the ball of how important civic education is for free, informed, engaged people. So I appreciate your attention to this issue in the book, and then now on the podcast. There's just enormous work to be done everywhere you look. K-12, higher ed, adults beyond that. There's just enormous work to be done.
So Paul, I'll just ask you maybe some more detail for our viewers. So why? Like, why does it matter? Why is civics education important? And what effect does a lack of an understanding about our democracy, our principles, and how our government functions, and what citizens' role is in the functioning of that government? Why does that matter? Why should that matter to Americans?
One cause, I think, of our polarization, as the term is used, that has deepened in the past decade and more, in which American citizens are angry with each other. They identify another party as the source of America's problems, and those people are un-American, or they're stupid, or they have bad motives. That has deepened and deepened. And one cause of that, I think, is a lack of civic knowledge, and then the lack of these civic virtues. So an impatience about American complex political forms, impatience with debate and disagreement, stems from a lack of knowledge that our forms of politics, local, state, national, were designed to be complicated so that we would have to argue with each other. So on the general premise, at the end of the day, you would get less stupid policy. You would avoid bigger problems. It wouldn't be perfect, but you would make fewer big errors. So if you don't understand that our entire political system, national down to local, is designed for that kind of argument, disagreement, then you're likely to be impatient and to have an easier path towards thinking, oh, those people are just stupid, or they have bad motives, or they're un-American, or those people on the other side. So, and that polarization means we cannot, as you wrote in your book, and you've talked about, we can't make stable, steady national policies. And this goes down to the state and local level as well. You wrote about Afghanistan. We didn't really have a failed war after 20 years. We had a sequence of one-year wars for 20 years. We couldn't stick to strategies because it was difficult in this polarized culture. Another dimension, most recently, after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in recent weeks, Quinnipiac, national polling firm, did a survey of American attitudes about this. And one question they posed, carefully done, demographically adequate sample. One question they posed is, if America were invaded, just like Ukraine has been invaded by a foreign enemy power, would you stay and fight? as at least many Ukrainians have done, and the government leadership has had. And the good news is that a majority of people who responded to the poll said they would stay and fight. The worrying part is that in the 18 to 34 group, men and women, a slim majority, plurality, said no, they would not. It was close, but it's very worrying to think that a rising generation does not value American self-government, American constitutional democracy, all of the freedom and prosperity and the dignity and nobility that come with being self-governed. And then the third is, as you know very well, and again, you've written about in your book, and George Washington made this point in the farewell address, our enemies will exploit our polarization, our tendency to think badly of another party and get wrapped up in our own partisan fights. They will exploit our sense of confidence, our lack of confidence in America. They will exploit that to erode our security and to threaten us. Vladimir Putin is prime example of having doing precisely that for 20 years now.
Paul, I think Putin really what he tries to do and what the Russians have tried to do with the sustained campaign of cyber-enabled information warfare against us, I think is to widen the divisions that already exist in our society, but really mainly to reduce our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. I think, for example, Vladimir Putin doesn't care who wins our elections as long as a large number of Americans doubt the legitimacy of the result. And what can we do to combat the conspiracy theories, right? The unfounded, sort of stop the steal and the idea that the 2020 election was stolen, or go back to the 2016 election if you want to lay some blame on the other side of the political spectrum, those who said, well, Russia, determined the outcome of the election. Both of those falsehoods reduce our confidence. How can we combat that and restore our confidence in probably maybe the most important act in a democracy, which is an election and the peaceful transfer of power?
Well, there are long games involved, and as someone with both an excellent educational background and public service, that there also needs to be some short game, shorter term measures taken. I think the long game involves national consensus efforts and then local attempts at consensus efforts to say we can provide an American civics and history education that is excellent, academically rigorous, that does not fall to the extreme either of saying America's perfect, and there are no sad, sorry, embarrassing episodes, failures in our history, nor the other extreme that America has always been a fraud and a failure in terms of its supposed political ideals from 1776 onward. As you know, I was asked to be part of a national study called Educating for American Democracy. Full disclosure, I was the intellectual conservative invited to be part of the lead team, colleagues at Harvard and Tufts and iCivics, but we did just that. So it can be done. Right. You can find national consensus, left, right, center views to say, this is a national priority. This ought to be a state and local priority. And there are short-term dimensions to that. Just what you're doing for people who do have positions of influence in media, in academia, in public life, to come together and say, we need to spend more time and effort on civic education. And again, these civic virtues. And then in the short term, start practicing these civic virtues. I could say, McMaster, he served in the Trump administration. He's just despicable. I don't have to listen to another word that guy says. Or, he's in the military or no, you're not, you're deficit spending and undermining the very freedom you enjoy as an American citizen to speak freely and to think freely. If you take that approach to your fellow citizens, to people who you should instead be listening to and then arguing with and responding. So again, this, both short-term and long-term measures that need to be taken.
Paul, it was kind of an unenviable task, right, for you to be part of this task force at a time when we were and still are very polarized in terms of the vitriolic partisan politics we see every day. And, of course, against the backdrop of, the 1619 Project and the endeavors to teach our young people that our country was founded to preserve slavery rather than founded on principles that ultimately made that horrible criminal institution unsustainable. How did you do it? What did you focus on in terms of common ground? What is it that we should all be able to agree on as Americans?
Well, first of all, I'm grateful to my colleagues at Harvard and at Tufts and in iCivics. I've been a professor in political science and taught at the U.S. Air Force Academy for, I've been in this game for 30 years. And most of higher education in our disciplines, the humanities, social sciences, has shifted in a leftward direction intellectually and politically. So I give credit to my colleagues for saying, if we want to write a national study that has credibility and meets the need of trying to improve civics education in K-12 public schools, improve the quality, the time devoted to it, the funding and support for it, we have to have conservatives, intellectual conservatives around this table. So to their credit, they reached out to me. And then we shared, some of us knew each other already, but we shared that fundamental commitment that the Federal Department of Education and the National Endowment for the Humanities had made a good choice, put some money behind a national study, and then to have people compete, write a proposal, that this was important as an academic endeavor. Both higher education and K-12 should do better at this, but is also crucial as a civic matter. We looked around and we thought education is either irrelevant, from K-12 to college and university, it's either irrelevant to the health and strength of our constitutional democracy, or we have some responsibility here to what's going wrong.
I think it's the absence of civics education that explains, I think, so much. I often think about, how patriotic and enthusiastic about our democratic principles and the rights that they enjoy that you see within our immigrant community, right? I mean, and I think that there's a correlation between, well, first of all, there's a self-selecting group, right, who are often
Yes.
coming here because they cherish, the freedoms that we often take for granted. But also, there's a civics education course as part of becoming a naturalized citizen.
Yes.
And could you tell our viewers a little bit about what should be in civics education for parents, especially? What should they expect their children to be learning, and what did you put into this great curriculum you developed, and what are the highlights? Well,
first of all, we would want parents and school leaders and teachers, district level and state level, to be interested in this study, Educating for American Democracy. We decided not to produce a national curriculum on civics and history to fit with our federal constitutional principles of government.
I should have said toolkit, right? Exactly. Okay. Yes.
Yeah. We decided that we should provide guidelines, that it was appropriate for the federal government to be interested in American civics and history education out in K-12 schools, just like George Washington was interested in an educated citizenry. That was appropriate, but under our form of government, the primary responsibility for writing the detailed curriculum would happen at the state and local level. So we called our final document a roadmap, a set of guidelines. And there's, of course, excellent content in it, and it's scintillating writing, and everybody out there should, find a copy of the report at the Educating for American Democracy website. What we chose as a basic approach was 7 main themes, K through 12 in grade bands, so you're not going to do this in the same way, K2 as you would for 9-12, but 7 main themes, none of them terribly surprising, but to divide it up this way, to say there's separate areas, like what are our forms of government since the founding, but also what is America's role in the world, a people in the world. Another theme, what does it mean to be participating as a self-governing citizen in a constitutional democracy? So all these 7 themes, and then how do they fit together? And then further, an interesting development, I particularly credit this to Daniel Allen at Harvard, to say that there are tension points here. There are design challenges, we call them, that in K-12 education, the teachers and the students, especially the older students, should grapple with the tensions and the ambiguities. These 7 themes don't fit together so easily. Principles and forms of our government don't fit together. so easily. So instead of saying, well, gee, this is a problem, this is a bug, you say, no, this is a feature of being a free people governed in these complicated ways. And let's talk about the disagreements and the challenges. And then that led to this third element, the civic virtues. If you have forms of government that really force any thoughtful person to think, gee, how do you really fit together law, forms of government with freedom? And how do you fit together equality with freedom, which is going to lead to differences and inequality? All these different tensions, that's going to take civic virtues. And we emphasize, for example, the civic virtue of reflective patriotism. It's a phrase we took from Alexis de Tocqueville, that Americans, like other free peoples, we should be grateful for and love America, grateful for this form of government, but reflective. It's not like it's as Tocqueville said, the old world. You know, I come from this patch of soil and this blood and this ethnic group alone. No, it's reflective. We're free, so we want to argue and disagree with America, with our forms of government. So reflective patriotism is civil disagreement, that we can have different philosophical views, party views, political views, and yet we respectfully listen to and disagree with each other.
You know, Paul, I think of the quotation from Richard Rorty, which he said in the beginning of that great book on pride, on national pride. He says national pride is like self to nations. Pride is to nations, like self-respect is to individuals, right? A necessary ingredient for self-improvement. And what I worry about is how kind of what I would call the orthodoxy of the new left, or post-colonial, postmodernist critical theories, or what we might even call the curriculum of self-loathing that is predominant in much of the American academy and is now present in secondary education as well. I'm thinking of Harold Zinn's book, the history of the American peoples and so forth. That yes. Interpretation, right, that we are the problem in the world. Which is actually a profoundly arrogant way, right, to look at history, yes. and just a wrong way to look at history. Really does need a corrective, and not with a contrived, happy view of our history, but a critical view of our history. To what degree do you think civics education is American history, and what do you think that parents and school boards ought to be involved with at the local levels to ensure that the curriculum in American history is neither one of those extremes, right? Is not a curriculum of self-loathing, or a curriculum of sort of a contrived happy view?
Yes, well, you're doing me a favor. So my background is political science and sort of the civics, constitutional side of it, but you're the historian. And that was another design of this study. We had an excellent historian from Harvard, Jane Kamensky, who was part of the founding team. And she got us to immediately think that an improvement we could suggest, again, to be adapted out in states and localities in their own ways, but we could improve civics education by insisting that history and civics were distinct, yet had to be braided from K through 12. So we did separate out categories of, here are the history questions we want to emphasize and themes we want to emphasize, and here are the civics one. But we always talked about the need in reality on the ground in a classroom. A teacher with a lesson plan or a project would be trying to braid these two to see how they interplay with each other. And actually, that reminds me, I forgot one other element of this Educating for American Democracy study. We emphasize questions topics more than we did the answers. We thought as an outline roadmap, set of guidelines, we did want some specific content. So, George Washington is there, and Lincoln is there, and the Constitution is there, and the Declaration is there, and the Civil War amendments are there, and great moments in American challenges in American foreign policy. There's content, historical, specific content, and specific civics content there. But we decided what was needed was an approach to suggest here are important topics and issues, and here are questions you ought to ask about it, and to push the teachers and the students to come up with answers based on curricular content that they have and sources, primary and secondary, and then have space to see, oh, there are different answers. Right. Because this is what free people will do, right? What should we do about Ukraine right now? and Russia invading Ukraine. Well, they're reasonable people could disagree about just what we should do. And that's true of every policy question, basically, some exceptions where there really shouldn't be reasonable disagreement, but and at every level of government and public policy. So that mode of question, answer, disagreement, discuss as itself a civic education we worked out in.
And I think one of the great services you've done is, I think if this curriculum, is adapted, or it's not a curriculum, but if this program, really is adopted at the local level, and becomes curricula that strikes this balance, right, between criticism, but then also recognition, right, of the freedoms and the privileges that we enjoy, in terms of our fundamental rights, and the rights that we have as citizens. I hope it rekindles a sense of agency, right, that we can actually build a better future. One of the problems, I think, in particular, Paul, with critical theory broadly and certain elements of it, like critical race theory, elements of critical race theory that essentially say that every problem is structural, every problem is institutional, and those adjectives appear right before every challenge we face. Hey, what does that leave citizens with, except kind of a toxic combination, right, of resignation and anger? And so I think what's really important about the work you've done is it teaches people, hey, you can do something. If you don't like what's happening at the local level, if you don't like what's happening at the national level, you can exercise your civic duties and affect a change. I mean, do you think this is a big part of it, is a restoration of kind of a sense of agency among our citizenry?
Yes, and we tried to, again, this guidelines, framework, there's only so much we could write, but we tried to say, here are the foundations for that, right? So the phrase from the Declaration that just forms of government must derive from the laws of nature and nature's God, right? There are principles of justice there, but then there's the freedom to say, in the final, I got in there, the closing lines of the Declaration of Independence: we mutually pledge our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor to do something about this injustice, that the British King and Parliament have imposed upon it. And then we have references to these extraordinary figures in American history who should give confidence to people today. It's not like Abraham Lincoln was somebody. He's a nobody. He's a nobody. The Hamilton musical shows, in a way, Hamilton was a nobody, right? Who was Elizabeth Cady Stanton?
Ulysses S. Grant, to throw in a military example of someone who helped in the emancipation of 4 million of our fellow Americans, right? He was a failed shopkeeper before the Civil War,
right? Who was Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave? So Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, these are people, some of our greatest statesmen and stateswomen never held public office.
And people who did something. People who did something.
They did something.
Rosa Parks. I mean, another example of someone really exercising her civic duties and affecting change.
Yeah. Who's Martin Luther King, right? I mean, it's just, yes, his family committed to his education. Minister, PhD, yes, but what did he see as a need, and then what did he do about it? So yes, if you look through that Educating for American Democracy roadmap, there are plenty of points in which we try to say the American story is an incredible story. The American experiment in self-government is an incredible experiment. It's not perfect, but that shouldn't lead to some sort of despair. And again, at the other extreme, it shouldn't lead to some sort of worship of only selected moments in the past, as if to say they're perfect and really nothing better can be done than that. So we did try to strike that balance.
Absolutely. So I think it is important to view our history critically, right? To understand that our republic was always, in the eyes of the founders, a republic that would require, in their words, constant nurturing, right? And of course, it wasn't until almost 100 years after the founding that we reconciled the greatest contradiction in our Constitution, which was the institution of slavery and the elimination of slavery. But of course, the struggle for equality of opportunity didn't end there with the failure of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan and the separate but equal period. But of course, citizens exercised their civic duties during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. And we did ultimately dismantle de jure segregation and inequality of opportunity. Well, hey, today, right, let's recognize de facto inequality of opportunity still exists, right? The zip code into which one is born still determines the numbers of obstacles you have to overcome to access the great promise of America. So Paul, what I would say is, where do you see us headed now? Are we, what was, the last several years of traumas, of unexpected length and difficulty of wars, of a financial crisis, 2008, 2009, of throw an opioid epidemic on top of that, transitions in the global economy that saw a lot of Americans lose their jobs, the vitriolic partisanship that we've had to endure. The January 6th assault on the Capitol in 2020. What is your prognosis now in terms of the health of our democratic institutions and processes, and the faith? What faith should we have in our democratic principles?
Well, that you write about it in your book, that war can be sobering. Some national security threat can be sobering and can get leaders with foresight, and educational leaders with foresight, thinking about educational responses to this. So you mentioned, Sputnik and the National Defense Act. In the Educating for American Democracy study, we suggest that two challenges during the Cold War period, the Sputnik challenge, and then in the 1980s, the competitiveness challenge, right? We had rebuilt the West German economy, rebuilt Japan's economy, South Korea, and now they were out competing us in certain ways. Those were two moments in which a national consensus across party lines, across sectors, private sector, public sector, formed to say, boy, we have to reinvest in education to deal with an external threat. The challenge now is that we are in something like a Sputnik moment, but we just don't see that we are, because the challenge is internal. Our loss of focus on civic education to prepare people to be formed, engaged citizens, our polarized detestation of each other, that these are national security challenges. These threaten and undermine our form of government and our freedom and our prosperity and security. We don't see that we are the source of the threat, that our modes of thinking, a kind of decay, is the threat. So you're making your effort. We tried in that Educating for American Democracy study to do that. I will say some good news stories. That report was released in 2021. The New York City public schools have adopted Educating for American Democracy as their template roadmap for revising, renewing their civics and history curriculum. We are working with a charter school network in Arizona, the Great Hearts Academies, which is over 30 schools across Arizona, Texas, and they're now in Louisiana. They are working with us to produce a detailed K-12 civics and history curriculum based on that model. And then we want to share it with any district in the country, any school in the country that's interested in it. So there has been some interest in this study. It's slow, it's messy, like American politics, because it's got to be state and local. It's got to work from the ground up. But I would say, in relation to this current security crisis, perhaps some far-sighted leaders can, in the education sector, in media and public policy and government, can look at how fortunate we are to have built the transatlantic alliance, to have built NATO. So unfortunately, the Ukrainians are not in it and are paying a price for that. But to be grateful for leaders in the past who made these decisions and made these commitments, and then people like you, HR, who fought and put their lives on the line to do this, how fortunate we are, but how fragile it is. And part of the investment and commitment we need to make, if we really are grateful and not just free riders, is investment in this kind of national consensus civic education, so we do have the civic strength and the resilience. And one other point: you've served all over the world, right? I've been fortunate in my education to have studied and lived and taught in Europe, in India, in Southern Africa. You and I know what many Americans might just take for granted: how incredibly free and prosperous and fortunate we are in so many ways compared to so many other people in the world. It's awful, horrible what Russia is doing to the Ukrainians right now. And there are some there are some, inspiring, noble moments and responses, including, the response from the Ukrainian government and humanitarian responses. But there's a larger lesson we might learn to say how incredibly fortunate we are to have this form of government and to have this prosperity and to have this peace and security. But it doesn't happen automatically. It's not self-sustaining automatically like some machine. People have to know it and be committed to it. And the operator's manual is very complicated, it's to perpetuate it. So maybe this crisis can have us thinking about some of these fundamental questions about our own civic education, about the alliances we've built and should be committed to. So I'm hopeful, and I'm grateful to you for taking time to talk about this.
Paul, I think it's impossible not to be inspired by the Ukrainian people and how they're fighting to preserve the freedoms that we enjoy, right? and should not take for granted. I think that's a really, really important point. And as we empathize with the Ukrainian people and do everything we can to support them in a small way, I hope that we'll also relearn to empathize with one another, because I'm really worried, Paul, that we've kind of lost the ability to do that, right? We've seen the toxicity of the information environment, and in particular, how social media, based on a business model that aims to get more and more advertising dollars through more and more clicks, and to get more and more clicks through more and more extreme content, is driving us apart from one another. And it seems like we're better connected to one another electronically than ever, but we're more distant from one another psychologically and emotionally and socially. So, Paul, what is your experience? What do you see in terms of the trends? Do you think this can be a way for Americans to come together? How are things at Arizona State, which is a great American university dedicated to improving the access of high quality education for Americans? What's your prognosis? Are we going to get better at empathizing with one another? Can the example of the Ukrainians maybe help us snap out of it and reverse some of the polarization that we've seen?
We're in the education business in part, right? You are at Hoover and the Stanford institution, so we are always hopeful, thinking that educational efforts matter. I do have to say, coming from the great state of Arizona, the late John McCain had a wonderful phrase, to be sober. Things are always darkest just before they go totally black. So we ought to be sober about that things could continue to get worse with our polarization and our incredible civic ignorance, and how that saps national confidence and young people having no interest. There are other poll results we looked at in Educating for American Democracy. Americans not really caring about living in a democracy. Young Americans, who cares? Why does it matter? So we should be sober to think just because we think it's hit rock bottom doesn't mean it has. It could get worse, but to see that it can be done, that people from across intellectual points of view, academics like in this study, can come together. You have tried to serve in a nonpartisan way in a very difficult national security position, and now with Hoover, try to convene conversations across points of view about America's security challenges and trying to restore strategic competence and strategic empathy. It can be done. You're as an historian, in the past, we had extraordinary moments of bipartisanship. The fact that Senator Vandenberg from the Republican Party supports Harry Truman, and who the heck Harry Truman is? Nobody, right? I mean, but he's the president of the United States after FDR dies, and the group of people who say we are in a long-term struggle, that extraordinary war, that great war, the Second World War, that was not the end. That was the end of one chapter, and we are in another chapter now. And we have got to pull together and make some major sacrifices and major strategic reorientations, including educationally. Well, that doesn't happen without Vandenberg in the Senate, and certain number of Republicans to say, okay, well, our party, the Republicans, had a certain view for a certain number of decades. Now, we're sober. We're Americans in this together. We will come together. So if you have some study of history, that kind of thing.
I'm thinking of Everett Dirksen's role. Yes. Working with Lyndon Johnson on civil rights. This is, we've been able to do it in the past.
Yeah.
And we began conversations with what we could agree on instead of what we disagreed on.
Yes.
You know,
and since you talked about disinformation, just a point about that. That's a challenge we faced before. New forms of media, and the challenge of how to make the best out of a new kind of mode of information, and how to avoid the kind of tribalism and sorting that you mentioned earlier. So we, in our school, we have a public affairs series. We call it the Civic Discourse Project. We invite distinguished public intellectuals and academics. You've spoken in that series. We had, around the time you came last fall, we had Jonathan Rauch, longtime fellow at the Brookings Institution, career journalist turned thinker about journalism and media and politics. His most recent book is called The Constitution of Knowledge, to try to make a direct connection between our complicated form of government.
I just ordered it. I've got it around here somewhere. Yeah,
connection between.
Well, this is a corrective.
Yeah. To
this critical theory nonsense, right? That there is no such thing as truth, right? That
right. And Jonathan's saying left and right people, smart people on left and right, ought to come together on a consensus about this. Our whole form of government is now at risk because of civic ignorance, failure of civic education. And then part of it is we're not educating ourselves, K-12, university level, but then in crucial professions, journalism and the media, technology professions, to be aware of the civic dangers and the civic costs of not being committed to disagreeing, arguing it out, hearing different points of view, so that we can sort out, it's difficult, sort out what is garbage, what is less trustworthy from what is more reliable, and what might get us closer to the truth. So he cites various new institutions, voluntary associations, Tocqueville would call them, right? New organizations forming, new coalitions forming, as to say, look, we don't just have to despair and throw up our hands and say, oh, this is awful, this whole internet thing and this disinformation thing. There have been moments like this in the past with American media and sources of information. And look right now, in the past decade, the past 5 years, people have done things. They've recognized there's a problem, and they've tried to do what they could to form a new organization or try and set up new protocols or new kinds of information. I think in K-12, we tried to work this into the Educating for American Democracy study. Okay, I get it that we still have a national consensus that math education is very important, and pre-technological, pre-engineering education is very important, and being prepared to get a job, for K-12. And then obviously that means reading, reading and communication is very important. But we have got to carve out some time or figure out how to weave into those subjects this kind of civic education, so young people grow up knowing it's a complicated information environment. And information could be your friend or your enemy, and there's going to be a lot of it out there. So how do you sort through it? We've got to work that into our educational systems now, along with the more traditional civics and history education.
Well, Paul, a lot of people have been admiring the problem, I would say, of polarization, and you did something about it. You and your team did something about it, and you're doing something about it every day at Arizona State University. I just want to give you the last word. What can our viewers and what can our listeners do? What would you ask them to do besides read the work that you've done and apply it? And we'll make sure the link is up and we make it accessible to everybody. But what can individual Americans, what can parents do? What can teachers do to help address what I think we all sense is a problem of this lack of confidence, right? In our common identity as Americans and our democratic principles, institutions, and processes. What would you charge us with?
Well, thank you. You asked me earlier, what's the view from Arizona State University? So I have to give credit to the Arizona government, state government, the legislature, and the governor 6 years ago to say there ought to be an investment, a funded mandate from the Arizona state government to say there will be a new department at Arizona State University, civic and economic thought and leadership, to bring more attention and focus to these in an appropriate higher education, liberal arts way, debate and discussion, but with that word leadership at the end of this new department, to get young people thinking about service and leadership, public sector and private sector. So all around the country, educational leaders could be thinking, whether it's private universities and colleges, public universities, we're an open book. We have a lot of information on our website. Other public universities have started to adapt our model and do their own thing. Texas, North Carolina, Tennessee, Utah. So there's higher education reform work to be done, and people could look at and try and learn from our mistakes and from our successes as a school, as a department. There's obviously work to be done in K-12, and that can be, individuals matter in our free form of government, our free politics. Individual parents, groups of parents, boards of education, superintendents of schools, teachers can make a difference. Find these resources. Again, what you and I are recommending is the points of agreement along with the disagreement. What are the national consensus points about better civics and history education, and try and work from there. And there are examples of that happening out in the country. And then for young people, I would say there have been two books written by university presidents in the past couple of years, which very much validate what the Arizona state government did. One by the former president of Harvard, Derek Bach, a book called Higher Expectations, questioning whether or not American higher education is educating young people for the demands, challenges, the battlegrounds of the 21st century. And he has several worries. And the first one he picks is civics education. And I think for us, since we're on a Hoover Institution podcast and both of us are conservatives, it's important to note he's not a conservative, really. He's never been known as a conservative. And then another book, Ron Daniels, president of Johns Hopkins University, a book with the extraordinary title, What Universities Owe Democracy. And so in a way, he takes that one important theme from Derek Bach's book, and the Daniels book was published in 2021, and he makes it the entire theme of a book, the failure of civics education. And it's really great because he not only talks about civic knowledge quite specifically, historical, institutional, constitutional civic knowledge, but also these civic virtues that university students should be exposed to, whether it's required or encouraged, different points of view about important intellectual, academic, and civic political topics. And they should learn to hear and see reasonable people with facts and strong points of view, hear them disagree with each other and go back and forth. So those are two sort of external validations. And so anybody out there in the country could find those books and say, well, what is my college doing about that? What is my university doing about that? What reforms could we take?
Okay, so I'm going to wrap up with a few recommendations as well.
Sure.
So in terms of how we got to this point, I think it's tough to beat Christopher Lash's book, The Revolt of the Elites. Recommend that book.
Wonderful.
And then if you want sort of another left-leaning, political philosopher, I think Richard Rorty's Achieving Our Country is a good book to really explain from not a conservative perspective, yes, the importance of confidence in our democracy. And then a book that I've just finished. It's a long essay. You can read it in one sitting. It's just called Freedom by Sebastian Junger. And it's organized into 4 succinct chapters, I think 4, the third of which is called Fight. And it's about how the word freedom comes from the need to fight for it, which we're seeing obviously from the Ukrainians today. So Paul, we get to work with a younger generation that is much pilloried these days, because of how active they are on social media and interested in the metaverse, instead of the real world and so forth. But I'll tell you, every time I interact with young people, whether it's at Arizona State, where I'm privileged to be, a visiting fellow, and here at Stanford, I just come away energized and with greater confidence in the future. And so I think you've been a big part of generating my confidence by reinvigorating civics education and connecting it to a sense of who we are as Americans. I can't thank you enough for joining us for a discussion about this important topic, the work that you've done, and to help us learn about a battleground, close to home, which is, I think, the battle to restore our strategic confidence in who we are as a people and in our democracy. So, on behalf of the Hoover Institution, thank you so much, Paul, for being with us.
Thank you, HR. I'll borrow a phrase I learned from my military colleagues at the Air Force Academy. It's great to be back to back in a trench with you. fighting on these important topics and restoring our civic health and our strategic confidence. Thank you so much for your work.
Well, I'd rather be next to you in a tank than back to back.
Good point.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you so much.
Battlegrounds is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.